The Cosmic Senate was the largest structure Hana had ever seen. It stretched across space like a metal planet, its silver walls curving away into the darkness. Ships from hundreds of worlds docked at its many ports. Some vessels looked like crystals, others like living creatures, and a few appeared to be made of pure light. Hana Kim pressed her face against the small window of the human transport ship. At 28 years old, she was the youngest person ever sent to represent Earth at the Galactic Assembly. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the basic blue uniform that marked her as a human diplomat. First time. Seeing it? Asked Jin Woo, the older man sitting beside her. He was Earth's main ambassador, a calm person with gray hair and kind eyes. He had been coming to these meetings for 3 years now, ever since humanity had joined the galactic community. It's huge, Hannah whispered. How many people are in there? Representatives from 847 different species, Jin Woo said. Some have been part of this community for 50,000 years. Others joined just a few hundred. Years ago, and then there's us? Hannah nodded. Humans were the newest members, accepted only because they had finally learned to travel between stars. Most other species still saw them as children playing with adult toys, their ship docked with a soft bump. The airlock opened and they stepped into a corridor filled with beings that looked nothing like humans. A creature with 6 legs and purple skin walked past, talking in a language that sounded like musical bells. Another being floated by, its body made of what looked like living water. Stay close, Jin Woo said. And remember what we discussed? We are here to watch and learn, nothing more. Hannah followed him through the winding corridors. The walls showed moving pictures of different worlds, some with red skies, others covered in crystal forests, and some that seemed to be made entirely of gas. Each image represented a world that belonged to the galactic community. They entered a massive chamber. That took Hannah's breath away. The ceiling stretched so high she couldn't see the top. Thousands of seats were arranged in circles, each section designed for different types of beings. Some seats were filled with water for aquatic species. Others glowed with heat for creatures that lived near stars. The human section is over there, Jin Woo pointed to a small group of seats near the back. They were marked with Earth symbol, a simple blue and green circle dot as they walked. Hana noticed how other beings looked at them. Some stared with curiosity, others with what seemed like pity. A few didn't look at all, as if humans weren't worth noticing. They sat down in their assigned seats. Hannah looked around and felt very small. The humans had been given just 12 seats in a chamber that held thousands. She could see Dr. Yuna Park, the head of Earth's science team, sitting 2 rows ahead. Next to her was Commander Hyuk Min from Earth's Small Space Defense Force. A deep sound filled the chamber, like a bell the size of a mountain. All conversation stopped. At the center of the room, a platform rose from the floor. On it stood a being that looked like it was made of living metal. Its voice echoed through the chamber without any need for speakers. I am Chancellor Vexov. The Alteron Republic, the being said. Its words were automatically translated into every language in the chamber. We gather today to discuss the greatest threat our galaxy has ever known. The lights dimmed, and a huge display appeared above the chamber. It showed a map of their galaxy with billions of stars twinkling like diamonds. But Hana noticed something wrong. Large sections of the galaxy were completely black, empty spaces where stars should have been. The great silence continues to spread, Chancellor Vex continued. In the past 1,000 years, it has consumed 400 star systems. Billions of beings have vanished without a trace. Entire civilizations have been erased from existence. Hannah felt cold fear creep up her spine. She had read about the Great Silence in her preparation files, but seeing it displayed like this made it real. The black areas were growing, spreading, like an infection across the galaxy. Today, the eldest species will present their solutions, the Chancellor announced. We will hear from those who have survived other galactic disasters, those whose wisdom spans tens of thousands of years. A section of the chamber began to glow, and a being that looked like a walking tree stepped forward. When it spoke, its A voice sounded like wind through leaves. I am Elder Threnody Prime Speaker for a species that has lived through 12 galactic cycles. We have seen threats before. We have survived by making hard choices. The tree being gestured and new images appeared on the display. They showed evacuation ships, massive structures being built around certain stars, and what looked like barriers made of energy. Our proposal is simple, the Elder continued. We save what can be saved. We move the most important civilizations to protected areas. We sacrifice the younger species to buy time for the older ones. Hannah felt sick. The Elder was talking about abandoning entire worlds, letting billions die to save billions more. She looked around and saw that many of the older species were nodding in agreement. Another being stood up. This one looking like a giant crystal. Its voice rang like a bell when it spoke. The Caltron Collective agrees with this approach. We have calculated the acceptable losses. 40% of current galactic civilization must be abandoned. This includes all species less than 10,000 years old. Hannah realized with horror that this included humanity. Earth would be one of the planets left behind. More speakers followed. Each was older and more advanced than humans could imagine. They talked about retreating to other dimensions, building massive shields around important star systems, or even abandoning this galaxy entirely. But they all agreed on one thing: the younger species would be sacrificed. Jin Woo sat perfectly still beside her, his face showing no emotion. But Hannah could see his hands clenched into fists. Dr. Una Park had her head down, taking notes that she would probably never get to use. As the presentations continued, Hannah found herself studying the data being shown. Something bothered her about the pattern of disappearances. The Great Silence wasn't random, it moved in specific ways, following paths that almost looked planned. She pulled out her small computer and began running calculations. As a xenolinguist, her job was to study how different species communicated. She had spent years learning to see patterns in alien languages, to find meaning in things that seemed meaningless. The numbers she was seeing didn't match what the speakers were saying. The Great Silence wasn't just destroying, it was following mathematical sequences. The timing between disappearances, the locations it chose, even the way it moved from system to system. It all followed patterns that reminded her of something: language. Patterns. Jin Woo, she whispered, showing him her screen. Look at this. He glanced at her computer, then quickly looked away. Not now, Hannah. We're here to observe. But this is important, she insisted. They're wrong about what the Great Silence is doing, Hannah. His voice was firm. We are the newest species here. These beings have been studying this problem for centuries. We listen and learn, that's all. She wanted to argue, but another speaker was standing up. This one was the strangest yet, a being that seemed to be made of pure energy, constantly shifting between different shapes. I am Nexari Prime, it said. My species has existed since before this galaxy formed its current spiral arms. We have watched the Great Silence for longer than most of you have existed. We know what must be done. The chamber fell completely silent. Even the eldest species showed respect for this being. The final protocol, Nexari Prime announced. We collapse 40% of the galaxy to create an impenetrable barrier. The Great Silence will be stopped, and the core systems will survive. The display showed a simulation of what this would mean. Entire spiral arms of the galaxy would be destroyed, taking 200 billion sentient beings with them. But the central core would be protected. The vote will be held in 1 standard hour, Chancellor Vex announced. All species may speak before we decide. Hannah's heart was racing. They were about to vote on the destruction of half the galaxy, including Earth, and she was the only one who had noticed that the Great Silence might not be what they thought it was, but she was just human. The youngest, least experienced species in the chamber. Who was she to question the wisdom of beings older than her entire civilization? The hour was almost up. The ancient beings continued their presentations with cold, calculated precision. Each speaker was older than human civilization. And they all shared the same terrible certainty about what needed to be done. Hannah watched as a creature that looked like living liquid metal flowed onto the speaking platform. Its voice bubbled and hissed through the translators. The Mercurian Collective has analyzed the Great Silence for 3,000 years, it said. We have determined that emotional attachment to younger species is counterproductive. Logic demands we save the civilizations with the most accumulated knowledge and experience. The being displayed charts showing different species ranked by age and technological advancement. Humans appeared near the bottom of the list, just above species that had only discovered fire a few hundred years ago. The mathematics are simple, the Mercurian continued. One Alteron citizen, with 50,000 years of memories and knowledge, is worth more than 1,000 humans who have barely learned to leave their home planet. Hannah felt anger building in her chest. They were talking about her entire species, like they were numbers in an equation. But she forced herself to stay quiet and keep studying the data. Being that looked like a walking mountain took the platform next. Its voice was so deep it made the floor vibrate. The stone speakers have witnessed the birth and death of stars, it rumbled. We have seen the Great Silence destroy worlds that were older and wiser than Earth. This is not about cruelty. It is about survival. The creature showed images of beautiful worlds that had been consumed by the Great Silence. Cities that had stood for millions of years reduced to nothing. Art and literature created over eons lost forever. These civilizations begged for mercy, the stone speaker said. They offered their entire populations as sacrifices to save their knowledge. The Great Silence showed no interest in negotiation, it simply erased them. More speakers followed, each one adding to the weight of evidence. The quantum dancers, beings of pure energy who existed across multiple dimensions at once, explained how they had tried to communicate with the Great Silence. Their attempts had resulted in the loss of 17 star systems, the Void Whisperers. Ancient machines that had outlived their organic creators presented recordings of the Great Silence in action. The images were terrifying, stars simply blinking out of existence, planets vanishing as if they had never been there. We have tried everything, said the lead Void Whisperer, its mechanical voice echoing through the chamber. Communication, appeasement, resistance, flight, nothing works. The Great Silence cannot be reasoned with or stopped. It can only be delayed. Hannah continued working on her computer, analyzing every piece of data they presented. The more she studied the patterns, the more convinced she became that everyone was missing something important. The Great Silence didn't move randomly. It followed specific paths through space, pausing at certain types of star systems longer than others. It seemed to spend more time around systems with multiple intelligent species, as if it was studying them. Most telling of all, it always sent smaller probes ahead of the main phenomenon. These probes would arrive at a system and seem to examine everything carefully before the Great Silence itself arrived. That wasn't the behavior of something that just wanted to destroy. Dr. Una Park, sitting a few rows ahead, caught Hannah's eye and mouthed the words, "What are you doing?" Hannah showed her the computer screen, but Una just shook her head and pointed toward the speakers. The presentations were becoming more horrifying as they continued. The temporal weavers, who could see possible futures, showed images of what would happen if they did nothing. The Great Silence would consume the entire galaxy within 10,000 years. Every intelligent species would be extinct. But the final protocol will work, said their speaker, a being that seemed to exist in several different time periods at once. We have seen the future where we implement it. 60% of the galaxy survives. Civilization continues. The cost was staggering. 200 billion sentient beings would die instantly when they collapsed 40% of the galaxy. Trillions more would die in the chaos that followed. Entire species would be wiped out, their cultures and histories lost forever. Commander Hyuk Min, the human military representative, was taking careful notes about the weapons technology being discussed. The elder species had the power to destroy entire star clusters, to make stars go supernova on command, to tear holes in space itself. The weapon systems required are already in place, explained the Nexari Prime. We have been preparing for this possibility for millions of years. The galactic barrier generators have been positioned throughout the target zones. We need only activate them. Hannah felt sick listening to how casually they discussed unimaginable destruction. These beings had lived so long that they thought in terms of geological time. To them, the death of billions was just a statistic a new speaker took. The platform, something that looked like a cluster of floating crystals that sang instead of speaking. The translation made their voice sound like a choir. The Crystal Collective wishes to address the emotional concerns some species may have, they sang. We understand that younger races form attachments to individual lives. This is natural but ultimately harmful to the greater good. The crystals projected images of their own history, times when they had been forced to sacrifice part of their civilization to save the rest. They had made these choices dozens of times over their million-year existence. Emotional thinking leads to extinction, they continued. Logical thinking leads to survival. We have survived because we learned to see beyond individual concerns. Hannah noticed that Jin Wu was gripping his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. This wasn't just about humanity anymore. They were discussing the elimination of thousands of species, many of which had done nothing wrong except being younger than the elder races. The final presentation came from a being so ancient that it had to be supported by mechanical devices to continue existing. Its voice was barely a whisper, but every word carried the weight of eons. I am the last keeper of the first civilization, it wheezed. I have lived for 800,000 years. I have seen galaxies born and die. I tell you this truth, sentiment is the enemy of survival. The ancient beings showed images from the early days of the galaxy, when thousands of species had existed that were now extinct. It had watched them all die, usually because they had refused to make the hard choices necessary for survival. The young species always believe they can find a better way, it said. They think their fresh perspectives will solve problems that we ancients have struggled with for millennia. This belief has killed more civilizations than any weapon. The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. The ancient being was talking directly about species like humanity, young races, who thought they could solve anything with enough creativity and determination. The great silence is not a puzzle to be solved, the last keeper continued. It is a force of nature, like entropy or gravity. You cannot negotiate with a black hole. You cannot reason with a supernova. You can only survive by acknowledging reality and acting accordingly. The chamber fell silent as the last keeper finished speaking. The weight of 800,000 years of experience hung in the air like a heavy fog. Chancellor Vex stepped forward again. We have heard from the eldest and wisest among us. Their counsel is clear. The final protocol represents our only hope for survival. Hannah's hands were shaking as she continued her analysis. She had found something in the data that none of the ancient speakers had mentioned. The great silence always paused before consuming a system. Not for long, sometimes just a few days, but it always paused. During those pauses, it sent out complex energy patterns that looked almost like attempts at communication. The patterns were too large and too powerful for most species to detect, but they were there in the sensor data. Counselor Vex, a voice called out from the chamber. The Alteron Republic requests permission to call for the vote. The vote is recognized, Vex replied. All species will now indicate their support for the final protocol. We begin with the eldest civilizations. One by one, the ancient species voted yes. The Crystal Collective sang their approval. The stone speakers rumbled their agreement. The temporal weavers confirmed that this was the future that offered the best chance of survival. As the vote continued, it became clear that the elder species were unanimous. They had studied this problem for centuries and they all reached the same conclusion. The final protocol was the only way. The vote moved to the younger species. Many of them voted yes as well, trusting in the wisdom of their elders. Others abstained, unable to vote for their own extinction but unwilling to oppose the ancients. The human delegation, Chancellor Vex announced. Jin Wu stood slowly. The United Earth Government. He began, then stopped. Hannah could see the conflict in his face. How could he vote to condemn his own species? But how could he vote against the unanimous wisdom of beings who had lived for hundreds of thousands of years? Hannah couldn't stand it anymore. Her hand shot up into the air. The silence that followed Hannah's raised hand was unlike anything the Galactic Assembly had ever experienced. 847 species, many older than Earth's solar system, stared at the young human woman who had dared to interrupt. The most important vote in galactic history, Chancellor Vex's metallic features shifted into what might have been confusion. His voice carried a note of disbelief when he spoke. "The human delegation appears to have a question," he said, the universal translator struggling with his tone. "However, this is a voting session. Questions were to be asked during the presentation. Period." Hannah's heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she kept her hand raised. Around her, she could feel the weight of thousands of alien stares. Some seemed curious, others annoyed, and many appeared to be looking at her the way someone might look at a child who had interrupted an important adult conversation. Jin Wu grabbed her arm and tried to pull it down. "Hannah, what are you doing?" he whispered urgently. "Sit down, please." But Hannah had spent the last hour watching the elder species calmly discuss the death of her entire civilization. She had listened to them explain why humans were expendable, why younger species didn't matter, why 200 billion lives were an acceptable loss. She couldn't stay silent anymore. "I need to speak," she said, her voice carrying clearly through. The chamber's translation system, a sound like grinding metal, came from the Nexari Prime section. It might have been laughter, or it might have been annoyance. "The newest species wishes to delay our vote? How predictable." The ancient being who called itself the last keeper of the first civilization wheezed from its mechanical support system. "Young races always believe they have something important to add. This is why they rarely survive their first galactic crisis." Dr. Yuna Park was making frantic gestures for Hannah to sit down. Commander Hyukmin looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. The other human delegates were staring at her in horror, knowing that she was about to destroy any chance humanity had of being taken seriously by the galactic community, but Hannah had seen something in the data that none of the ancient speakers had addressed. Something that might change everything if she could just get them to listen. "The human delegation has not yet voted," she said, standing up despite Jin Wu's attempts to stop her. "We have the right to speak before casting our vote." Chancellor Vex consulted with several other ancient beings. After a moment of discussion that sounded like a symphony of grinding metal, musical tones and electronic beeps, he spoke again. "The human is technically correct. Each species may make a brief statement before voting. However, we remind the human delegation that they are here as observers and students. Their opinions carry little weight in matters of galactic importance." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, even through the universal translator. But he had given her permission to speak, and that was all she needed. Hannah stepped forward, moving past Jin Wu despite his whispered pleas for her to reconsider. She walked down the steps toward the central speaking platform, feeling like she was moving through a dream. Every step took her closer to either saving her species or destroying any chance humanity had of surviving in the galactic community. The platform rose to meet her as she approached, lifting her up so that she could be seen by the entire assembly. The chamber was designed to make speakers feel important, but instead Hannah felt incredibly small. She was surrounded by beings who had accumulated wisdom across millions of years, and she was about to tell them they were wrong. "My name is Dr. Hannah Kim," she began, her voice echoing through the vast chamber. "I am a xenolinguist from Earth. I study how different species communicate." A sound like musical laughter came from the Crystal Collective. "The primitive wishes to lecture us about communication? How amusing." Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to continue. "I have been analyzing the data you've presented about the Great Silence, and I believe you're making a fundamental error in your interpretation." The chamber erupted in sounds that the translator couldn't handle properly. Clicks, roars, electronic screeches, and musical notes all blended together in what was clearly alien laughter and outrage. An error? The stone speaker's voice made the platform vibrate beneath Hannah's feet. We have studied this phenomenon for thousands of years. Your species has known about it for less than a decade. That's exactly my point, Hannah said, raising her voice to be heard over the continuing sounds of alien amusement and anger. You've been studying it so long that you've stopped seeing what's actually happening. The Nexari Prime's energy form flickered with what might have been irritation. Explain yourself quickly, human. We grow tired of this disruption. Hannah activated her portable computer and connected it to the chamber's display system. Her data appeared on the massive screen above the assembly, showing the patterns she had discovered in the Great Silence's movements. Look at the sequence of disappearances, she said, highlighting specific star systems on the galactic map. The Great Silence doesn't move randomly, it follows mathematical patterns. Prime number sequences, specifically? The ancient beings fell silent, studying her data. Hannah could see some of them running their own quick calculations, checking her work. Furthermore, she continued, look at the timing between each disappearance. The intervals follow the Fibonacci sequence. These aren't random events, they're deliberate mathematical communications. The last keeper of the first civilization wheezed what might have been a laugh. Even if that were true, it proves nothing. Intelligence can be destructive. The ancient plague machines of the Verkath galaxy followed mathematical patterns as well, and they still exterminated every living thing they encountered. But that's not all, Hannah said, bringing up more data. The Great Silence always sends smaller probes ahead of its main presence. These probes don't destroy anything. They scan, they analyze, they study. And most importantly, they send out energy patterns that look exactly like attempts at establishing communication protocols. She highlighted the energy signatures her analysis had uncovered. These patterns matched the universal mathematical constants that any intelligent species would recognize. Pi, the golden ratio, prime number sequences. The Great Silence is trying to say hello. The chamber fell completely silent. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the station's life support systems. Then the temporal weavers spoke, their voice carrying the weight of prophecy. We have seen the futures where communication is attempted. They all end in extinction. The Great Silence cannot be reasoned with. Have you actually tried communicating with it? Hannah asked. Or have you just assumed it was hostile and attacked? It? The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Hannah realized she had just accused the wisest beings in the galaxy of making assumptions without proper investigation. Chancellor, Vex's voice carried a dangerous edge when he responded. Human, you are suggesting that civilizations with hundreds of thousands of years of experience have failed to consider the most basic approach to first contact. This is insulting beyond measure. I'm suggesting that sometimes experience can blind you to new possibilities, Hannah replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. The Great Silence operates on a scale so vast that its gentlest touch destroys entire star systems. It's not trying to hurt us, it's trying to communicate with us, but it doesn't know how to speak softly enough for us to survive the conversation. Dr. Una Park was frantically shaking her head, trying to signal Hannah to stop. Jinwoo looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The other human delegates were staring at her in a mixture of admiration and terror. You're asking us to risk the survival of our entire galaxy on the theory that this force of destruction is simply misunderstood? The stone speaker's voice carried notes of both anger and incredulity. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that you're about to commit genocide on an unprecedented scale because you refuse to try the one thing you haven't attempted yet. Hannah shot back. The words echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. She had just accused the elder species of being willing to commit genocide. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Alien voices rose in outrage, protest, and what sounded like calls for her immediate removal from the chamber. The translators couldn't keep up with the flood of angry responses in hundreds of different languages. But through it all, Hannah noticed something important. A few of the ancient beings weren't shouting. They were studying her data, running calculations, and looking thoughtful. The Crystal Collective's song voice cut through the chaos. The human raises an intriguing point. We have always assumed hostile intent because the results were hostile. But what if the intent and the results don't match? Chancellor Vex raised his hand for silence. The Valdra's Council also finds merit in examining these patterns more closely, he said slowly. We have not considered the possibility that the Great Silence might be operating on a scale that makes gentle contact impossible. Hope flared in Hannah's chest. Some of them were actually listening, but then the Nexari Prime spoke, its energy form blazing with what looked like anger. This is exactly the kind of wishful thinking that destroys civilizations. The human offers us hope instead of facts, dreams instead of survival strategies. Then let me pee. The debate that followed Hannah's proposal would be remembered across the galaxy for millennia to come. Ancient species that had not disagreed with each other in thousands of years suddenly found themselves divided over whether to trust the analysis of a species that had barely learned to leave its homeworld. Chancellor Vex called for order as alien voices rose in heated discussion. Some species were speaking so rapidly that the universal translators couldn't keep up, while others were communicating through methods that had no translation at all, flashing lights, changing colors, and energy patterns that bypassed language entirely. The Alteron Republic calls for a structured debate, Vex announced, his metallic voice cutting through the chaos. Each Elder Council will have the opportunity to present their position on the humans' proposal. The Nexari Prime was the first to speak, its energy form blazing with conviction. This is madness disguised as hope. The human offers us theories based on days of analysis against our centuries of direct observation. The Great Silence has destroyed civilizations older and wiser than Earth. To trust it based on mathematical patterns is the height of foolishness. The ancient energy being projected images of the Great Silence's past destructions. Worlds that had tried to communicate with it, sending out peaceful greetings and mathematical messages. Every single attempt had ended in complete annihilation. The Xanthari Empire sent out welcome signals for 50 years, Nexari Prime continued. They were convinced that peaceful intent would be recognized. Their entire civilization was erased. In a single day, the quantum builders tried to establish mathematical dialogue. They were consumed while their messages were still being transmitted. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying. Dozens of species had tried exactly what Hannah was proposing, and all of them were now extinct. But then the Crystal Collective began to sing, their harmonic voices creating patterns that touch something deep in every listener's mind. The Nexari speaks truth about the past, but perhaps not about the present. We have reviewed the human's analysis, and her mathematical observations are correct. The patterns are there. The crystals displayed their own version of Hannah's data, enhanced with computational power that far exceeded anything Earth could produce. The mathematical sequences were even clearer when viewed through their advanced systems. The question is not whether the patterns exist, they sang. The question is what they mean. The human suggests communication. The evidence suggests destruction. Perhaps both can be true. The stone speakers rumbled their disagreement. Intention matters less than result. A falling mountain does not mean to crush the village below, but the village is still destroyed. The Great Silence may not intend harm, but harm is what it causes. Doctor. Una Park stood up from the human section, her voice shaking as she spoke. Permission to address the assembly? Chancellor Vex looked surprised. The humans wish to speak again? Dr. Park is our senior scientist, Jin Wu said, finally finding his voice. She has been studying the Great Silence data independently. Una walked down to join Hannah on the platform, her face pale but determined. I've been checking Dr. Kim's calculations, she said. Her mathematical analysis is correct, but I found something else. She activated her own computer, adding new data to the display. The energy signatures that the Great Silence emits, they're not just mathematical, they're scaled. Each signal is precisely calibrated to be detectable by the type of civilization it's approaching. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. If the signals were scaled, that suggested the Great Silence was actively trying to communicate appropriately with each species. When it approached the gas giant civilizations of the Helix Nebula, it used electromagnetic frequencies that those species could detect, Una continued. When it visited the crystal worlds of the Outer Rim, it used harmonic resonances that matched their communication methods. The last keeper of the first civilization wheezed from its support system. Yet all of those civilizations were still destroyed. Because they all made the same mistake, Hannah said, stepping forward. They treated first contact like a conversation between equals. But the Great Silence isn't equal to us. It's operating on a scale so vast that we're like bacteria trying to talk to a human. It's not that it wants to destroy us. It's that it doesn't know how to communicate without accidentally crushing us. Commander Yuk Min stood up from the human section, his military bearing evident even from a distance. Permission to speak, Chancellor? Vex nodded, clearly intrigued by the human perspective despite himself. I've been analyzing the tactical data, Yuk Min said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent his life studying threats. The Great Silence always approaches from the same vector. It follows the same patterns, uses the same methods. If it were truly hostile, it would vary its approach to avoid countermeasures. But it doesn't. It behaves like something that's following a protocol, not something that's hunting. The temporal weavers shimmered as they accessed possible futures. We have looked ahead to see the results of communication attempts, they said, their voice carrying the weight of prophecy. In every timeline where contact is attempted, civilizations are destroyed. Have you looked at timelines where the contact is attempted correctly? Hannah asked. Where we account for the scale difference and modify our approach accordingly? The temporal weavers fell silent. After a long moment, their leader spoke. We did not consider that variable. We assumed communication was communication, regardless of scale. Hope flared in Hannah's chest. If the temporal weavers hadn't looked at the right possibilities, then maybe the future wasn't as fixed as they thought. The Valdris Council, ancient even by galactic standards, spoke for the first time in the debate. Their representative was so old that it was more energy than matter, but its voice carried absolute authority. We have lived for 300,000 years, it said. We have seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. In our experience, the most dangerous moment for any species is when they believe they have found a solution that no one else could see. The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. The Valdris was describing exactly what she was doing, claiming to see something that countless older and wiser species had missed. However, the ancient being continued, we have also seen civilizations die because they refuse to consider new possibilities. Wisdom sometimes requires acknowledging the limits of experience. The debate continued for hours. Species that had never disagreed began to argue among themselves. Ancient alliances were strained as beings took sides based on their interpretation of the evidence, the quantum dancers, who existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, offered perhaps the most unsettling perspective. We have observed the Great Silence from directions that single-dimensional beings cannot perceive. They said, from our perspective, it appears to be lonely. The word sent a chill through the chamber. A force capable of destroying entire star systems, lonely? It travels alone through the void, the quantum dancers continued. It has been searching for something for millions of years. When it finds clusters of intelligence, it tries to make contact, but its very presence disrupts the delicate patterns of matter and energy that life requires. Dr. So Ra, a human communications engineer, stood up in the human section. That would explain the probe behavior, she called out. If it's lonely, it would want to study us before making contact. The probes aren't scouts for an invasion. They're attempts to learn how to communicate without causing harm. The chamber erupted in discussion again. The possibility that the Great Silence might be a lonely entity trying to make friends, rather than a destructive force, was almost too much for many species to accept, but not all the ancient beings were convinced. The Mercurian collective flowed onto the speaking platform, its liquid metal form reflecting the chamber lights like a mirror. Even if the humans are correct about the Great Silence's intentions, it said, the results remain the same. Civilizations die when it makes contact. Intention without capability is meaningless. A child with a nuclear weapon is still dangerous, regardless of whether they understand what they're holding. But what if we could teach it? Hannah asked. What if we could show it how to communicate without destroying us? The question hung in the air like a challenge. The ancient beings had spent so long preparing for threats that the idea of teaching something so powerful had never occurred to them. Chancellor Vex called for order as the debate threatened to spiral out of control. The humans have presented an alternative theory, he said. The question before us is whether we are willing to test it before implementing the final protocol. And if the test fails? Asked the stone speaker. If we attempt communication and the Great Silence destroys us anyway? Hannah took a deep breath. Then you implement the final protocol. But you'll know you tried everything possible before sacrificing 200 billion lives. The chamber fell silent as the weight of the decision settled over them. They were being asked to choose between the certainty of massive death and the possibility of universal salvation. We call for a vote, Chancellor Vex announced. All in favor of attempting communication before implementing the final protocol? The silence stretched on as thousands of beings considered the most important deci. The vote was closer than anyone had expected. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the elder species were genuinely divided. Ancient alliances that had lasted for millennia found themselves on opposite sides of a single question. Should they trust the analysis of the youngest species in the galaxy? When the final tally was announced, the results sent shockwaves through the chamber. By a margin of just 43 votes out of 847, the Assembly had agreed to attempt communication with the Great Silence before implementing the final protocol. Chancellor Vex's metallic features reflected the chamber lights as he spoke. The motion passes. The human delegation will be granted the opportunity to test their communication theory. However, the conditions are strict. Hannah felt her legs go weak with relief and terror. They had actually agreed to let her try. But now, she had to prove that her theory was correct or watch as billions of beings died because she had delayed their only chance of survival. The humans will have 72 standard hours to establish meaningful contact with the Great Silence. Vex continued. They will have access to the full resources of the Galactic Communication Array and technical support from any species that volunteers to assist. The Nexari Prime's energy form flickered with what looked like controlled anger. And when this attempt fails, as all others have, we will implement the final protocol immediately. There will be no further delays, no second chances. Understood, Jinwoo said, stepping forward to stand beside Hannah. The human delegation accepts these terms. Dr. Yuna Park moved to join them, followed by Commander Yuk Min and Dr. So-Ra. The small group of humans looked impossibly tiny in the vast chamber, but they were about to attempt something that might determine the fate of the entire galaxy. The Crystal Collective began to sing, their harmonious voices filling the chamber. The Crystal Collective offers our computational resources to the communication attempt. We are curious to see if the human perspective can succeed where others have failed. Several other species quickly volunteered their assistance. The Valdris Council offered their ancient wisdom and historical records. The Quantum Dancers provided access to their multi-dimensional observation capabilities. Even some species that had voted against the communication attempt offered technical support, unwilling to let pride interfere with a potential solution, but not everyone was supportive. The stone speakers rumbled their disapproval. We will not participate in this folly. When the humans fail, we will be ready to implement the final protocol without delay. Within hours, the largest communication array in galactic history was being assembled. Ships from dozens of species converged on coordinates near the galaxy's edge, where the Great Silence was expected to arrive next. The array would be powerful enough to send signals across entire star systems, but more importantly, it would be controlled by beings who understood the scale problem. Hannah found herself in the command center of the array, surrounded by beings so ancient and wise that just weeks ago she would have been terrified to speak in their presence. Now they were looking to her for guidance on how to contact the most powerful entity the galaxy had ever encountered. The first challenge is scale, she explained to the assembled team. Every previous attempt at communication has been conducted at our scale, sending signals that we could detect and understand, but the Great Silence operates on a cosmic scale. Our messages are probably too small for it to notice. Dr. J-Ho, a human mathematician who had been brought in to help with the calculations, was working with Valdris scholars to determine the proper signal strength. If we scale up our message to match the energy output of an entire star, it might be large enough for the Great Silence to detect, he said. But not so large that it damages the receiver, added a Valdris elder whose name translated roughly as ancient thinker of deep thoughts. The being had volunteered its 300,000 years of experience in stellar engineering. Dr. So-Ra was working with the Crystal Collective to design the actual message. We need something that clearly indicates intelligence but doesn't assume any shared cultural references, she explained. Mathematical sequences are our best bet, but we need to present them in a way that shows we understand the scale difference. The message they designed was elegant in its simplicity. It would begin with basic mathematical concepts, prime numbers, the Fibonacci sequence, pi, but each concept would be presented at a different scale. The prime numbers would be sent as pulses of energy equivalent to small stars. The Fibonacci sequence would be carved into space itself using controlled gravitational waves. Pi would be represented by the orbital patterns of artificial objects the size of moons. The message is designed to show that we understand scale, Hana explained to the assembled beings. We're not just sending mathematical concepts, we're showing that we can work at cosmic scale when necessary. Commander Hyuk Min was coordinating the defensive aspects of the operation. If this goes wrong, we need to be ready to evacuate the array in minutes, he said. We've positioned emergency gates throughout the structure. If the Great Silence responds with the same kind of contact that destroyed other civilizations, we can get everyone out. The Temporal Weavers had set up monitoring stations to observe possible futures in real time. We will watch for changes in the timeline as the communication attempt progresses, their leader explained. If the probability of success drops below 5%, we will recommend immediate evacuation. As the array neared completion, reports came in from across the galaxy. The Great Silence had been detected entering the outer edge of the galactic spiral arm where they were positioned. Long-range sensors showed the familiar pattern, first the small probes, scanning and analyzing everything they encountered, then the vast presence of the Great Silence itself. It's following the same approach pattern it always uses, Dr. Yuna, Park reported. The probes will reach our position in approximately 18 hours. The main phenomenon will arrive 12 hours after that. Hannah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical force. In less than 30 hours, she would learn whether her theory was correct or whether she had just doomed the galaxy by delaying the only known defense against an unstoppable force. The final preparations were completed in a frenzy of activity. Species that had never worked together before found themselves cooperating on the most important project in galactic history. Ancient technologies were combined with innovative human approaches to create something entirely new. Dr. Young Mi, a human ethics specialist who had been quietly observing the preparations, approached Hannah as the team made final adjustments to the array. I've been thinking about what happens if we succeed, she said quietly. If the Great Silence really is trying to communicate and we establish contact, everything changes. The entire structure of galactic civilization will have to be reconsidered, Hannah nodded. The elder species base their authority on age and experience. But if a force older and more powerful than all of them combined wants to communicate with us, their monopoly on wisdom ends. Some of them have already realized that, Young Mi said, glancing toward where the Nexari Prime was monitoring the preparations. That might be why some of the ancient species are so opposed to this attempt. It's not just about whether communication is possible, it's about whether they're ready for their position as the galaxy's ultimate authorities to be challenged. The thought sent a chill down Hannah's spine. If the Great Silence was indeed an intelligence beyond anything the galaxy had known, successful contact would reshape everything. The careful hierarchies based on age and accumulated wisdom would become meaningless in the face of a being that had existed longer than most species could imagine. Incoming probe signature detected, announced a quantum dancer whose multidimensional perceptions could track objects across several layers of reality. The Great Silence's advanced scouts are approaching the array. Every being in the command center fell silent. This was it, the moment that would determine whether Hannah's theory had any basis in reality. If the probes behaved as she predicted, scanning and analyzing without causing harm, it would be the first evidence that the Great Silence might indeed be trying to communicate rather than destroy. The probe arrived exactly as Hannah had predicted. Instead of immediately disrupting the array or attempting to destroy it, the small manifestation of the Great Silence began a careful examination of their communication setup. Energy beams swept across the massive transmitters, analyzing their purpose and construction. "It's scanning the array," Dr. Sora reported, her voice tight with excitement. "Just like the probe behavior we've observed at other locations, it's trying to understand what we've built." The probe spent several hours examining every component of the array. When it encountered the sections designed to operate at cosmic scale, it paused for much longer, as if recognizing that something was different about this approach. "The probe has completed its initial scan," reported the Valdris Elder. "It's withdrawing to a safe distance and ... Transmitting. The probe is sending a signal back to the main phenomenon." Hannah felt her heart racing. This was exactly what she had hoped would happen. The probe had recognized that their approach was different from previous attempts, and the 11 hours that followed were the longest in galactic history. As the Great Silence approached their position, tension aboard the communication array reached levels that threatened to tear apart the unprecedented cooperation between species. Hannah stood in the center of the command deck, surrounded by beings whose civilizations spanned millions of years, all waiting to see if her theory would save or doom them all. The weight of their stares was almost unbearable, but she forced herself to focus on the final preparations. "The probe signal has reached the main phenomenon," announced Dr. Tae-jun, a human data analyst who had been tracking the communication between the probe and the Great Silence. "We're detecting response patterns, but they're unlike anything in our databases." The temporal weavers shimmered as they observed the shifting possibilities of the future. "The timelines are fluctuating wildly," their leader reported. "We can no longer predict the outcome with any certainty. The human approach has introduced variables we have never encountered." This news was both encouraging and terrifying. If the temporal weavers couldn't predict the outcome, it meant that Hannah's approach was genuinely different from every previous attempt. But it also meant they were moving into completely unknown territory. The Nexari Prime, who had opposed the communication attempt from the beginning, pulsed with barely contained energy. "This uncertainty proves the folly of this approach. We are gambling the survival of our entire galaxy on the theories of a species that discovered space travel 3 years ago." "With respect," Dr. Unipark replied, "uncertainty is better than the certainty of 200 billion deaths. At least this way we have a chance." Chancellor Vex had arrived at the array to personally oversee the attempt. His ancient form stood motionless as he monitored the incoming data. "The Great Silence has altered its approach vector," he announced. "It is now heading directly for our position." A chill ran through the command center. Every previous encounter had followed the same pattern. The Great Silence would arrive at a star system, study it briefly, then consume everything within it. If it was changing its behavior, that could mean Hannah's theory was correct, or it could mean they had provoked it into a more aggressive response. "All personnel, prepare for possible emergency evacuation," Commander Hyuk Min announced over the array's communication system. "If the Great Silence exhibits hostile behavior, we will have approximately 30 seconds to abandon the array before it reaches us." Dr. Sora was making final adjustments to the communication array, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. "The message is ready to transmit," she reported, "but we'll only get one chance. If the Great Silence doesn't understand what we're trying to do, or if our approach is wrong, there won't be time for a second attempt." The message they had prepared was the culmination of everything humanity had learned about communication across species barriers. It began with the mathematical sequences that Hana had identified in the Great Silence's previous behavior, scaled up to cosmic proportions. Then it would demonstrate their understanding of the scale difference by presenting the same concepts at progressively smaller scales, showing that they could communicate across multiple levels of existence. "Incoming massive energy signature," called out a Valdris technician. "The Great Silence is 3 hours away and it's slowing down." This was unprecedented. The Great Silence had never slowed its approach to any star system. It always maintained the same velocity until it arrived and began its destructive contact attempts. "Why is it slowing down?" asked the Crystal Collective, their harmonic voices carrying notes of confusion and hope. "Maybe the probe told it something interesting," Hana said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If my theory is correct, the probe reported that we've built something designed for cosmic-scale communication. The Great Silence might be slowing down because it wants to approach more carefully." The ancient beings exchanged looks that needed no translation. If the Great Silence was capable of modifying its behavior based on new information, it suggested a level of intelligence and consideration that none of them had expected. "1 hour to contact," Commander Hyukmin announced. "All non-essential. Personnel should evacuate to minimum safe distance." But nobody left. Despite the danger, beings from across the galaxy stayed at their stations, unwilling to miss what might be the most important moment in cosmic history. The Great Silence arrived. Exactly on schedule, but its approach was unlike anything that had been observed before. Instead of the usual overwhelming presence that disrupted space itself, it maintained a careful distance from the array. Long-range sensors detected massive energy patterns, but they were contained and controlled rather than chaotic and destructive. "It's waiting," Dr. Unipark said, her voice filled with wonder. "The Great Silence is holding position at exactly the distance where its presence won't disrupt our equipment." Hannah felt her heart soar. This was exactly what she had hoped would happen. The Great Silence was demonstrating that it understood the scale problem and was trying to communicate without causing harm. "Begin transmission," she ordered. The array came to life with power that dwarfed entire star systems. The mathematical sequences were carved into space itself using gravitational waves, written in letters of pure energy that could be seen from light years away. The message was simple but profound. "We understand that you are trying to communicate. We want to talk to you too." For several minutes, nothing happened. The Great Silence maintained its position, and the array continued broadcasting the message at cosmic scale. Tension in the command center was so thick it felt solid. Then the response came dotted, started as a gentle pulse of energy, perfectly timed to match the mathematical sequences they had transmitted. The Great Silence was demonstrating that it had received and understood their message. But more than that, it was responding in kind, using the same mathematical language but adding new concepts that showed its vastly superior understanding of cosmic forces. "It's answering," Dr. Sora whispered, tears streaming down her face. "The Great Silence is actually answering our message." The response grew more complex as the Great Silence began to demonstrate its capabilities. It showed them mathematical concepts that no galactic civilization had ever discovered, scientific principles that explained phenomena that had puzzled scientists for millions of years, and artistic patterns of energy that were beautiful beyond description. But most importantly, it began to scale down its communications. Just as Hannah had predicted, the Great Silence started presenting the same concepts at smaller and smaller scales, showing that it understood the need to communicate at a level that wouldn't accidentally destroy its conversation partners. "This is incredible," breathed the Valdris elder. "It's teaching us how to communicate with it safely. It's showing us how to build receivers that can handle cosmic-scale messages without being destroyed. The communication continued for hours. The Great Silence demonstrated patience that spanned geological ages as it carefully taught the assembled galactic civilizations how to communicate across the vast difference in scale. It shared knowledge that transformed their understanding of physics, mathematics, and the nature of existence itself, but perhaps most remarkably, it began to share something else, loneliness through carefully modulated energy patterns. The Great Silence conveyed a sense of isolation that was almost overwhelming. It had traveled the cosmos for millions of years, searching for other intelligences to communicate with. But every time it found clusters of life, its attempts had resulted in destruction. It had been trying to learn how to speak softly, enough for smaller beings to survive the conversation. "It's been alone for so long," Dr. Young-Mi said, her voice filled with compassion. "Can you imagine existing for millions of years without anyone to talk to?" The realization transformed everything. The Great Silence wasn't a force of destruction. It was a lonely entity that had accidentally destroyed countless civilizations while trying to make friends. Its mathematical patterns hadn't been threats. They had been increasingly desperate, attempts to establish communication with beings too small to survive its gentlest touch. "We need to tell the rest of the galaxy," Hannah said. "Every species needs to know that we've made contact, and that the Great Silence isn't our enemy." Chancellor Vex was already transmitting updates to the Galactic Assembly. The news spread across the galaxy at the speed of light, carried by the fastest communication networks that civilization had ever built. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Species that had been preparing for extinction were suddenly celebrating the most important first contact in history. The final protocol was formally abandoned as unnecessary. The weapons designed to destroy half the galaxy were deactivated and dismantled, but not everyone was celebrating. The Nexari Prime's response came through the communication array with barely controlled fury. "The humans have delayed the final protocol and exposed our position to an unknown entity," it transmitted. "We demand immediate evacuation of all essential personnel. This contact must be terminated before the Great Silence realizes how vulnerable we are." The Great Silence already knows how vulnerable we are," Hannah replied. "It's known all along. That's why it's been so careful in its approach. It doesn't want to hurt us." The debate. The days following first contact transformed the galaxy in ways that no one could have predicted. The communication array that had been built for a desperate last attempt at dialogue had become the most important structure in galactic history. Ships from every major civilization arrived hourly, bringing scientists and philosophers who wanted to witness humanity's ongoing conversation with the Great Silence. Hannah found herself at the center of it all, serving as the primary translator between galactic civilization and an entity whose thoughts spanned cosmic distances. The responsibility was overwhelming, but she was discovering that communication with the Great Silence was becoming easier with each exchange. "It's learning how to speak more quietly," she explained to the assembled representatives. "Each day, its messages require less energy to transmit and receive. It's figuring out how to compress cosmic-scale thoughts into patterns we can understand." Dr. Sora was leading the technical team that maintained the communication equipment. "We're having to upgrade the receivers daily," she reported. "As the Great Silence gets better at scaling down its communications, we need more sensitive equipment to catch the subtleties in its messages." The most remarkable discovery had come when they realized that the Great Silence wasn't just one entity. It was part of a community of cosmic-scale intelligences that existed throughout the universe. They had been trying to establish contact with smaller-scale life for millions of years, but the physics of their existence made gentle communication nearly impossible. "There are dozens of them," Dr. J. Ho explained, showing the assembled beings a map of cosmic-scale intelligence signatures that the Great Silence had shared. "They exist in the spaces between galaxies in the vast emptiness that we thought was just void. They've been watching us develop, hoping we would eventually become advanced enough to communicate with them." The revelation had sent shockwaves through galactic civilization. Everything they thought they knew about the universe was wrong. The empty spaces between galaxies weren't empty at all. They were home to intelligences, so vast that entire star clusters were like neurons in their thoughts. Chancellor Vex had arrived at the array to coordinate the galactic response to these discoveries. "The implications are staggering," he said, his ancient voice carrying notes of wonder that had been absent for millennia. "We are not the highest form of intelligence in the universe. We are not even close." But not all reactions were positive. The Nexari Prime had withdrawn from the communication project entirely, along with several other elder species. They were struggling to accept that their millions of years of accumulated wisdom were insignificant compared to entities that thought in terms of cosmic evolution. "The rigid hierarchy of galactic civilization is crumbling," Dr. Young-Mi observed, quietly to Hannah. "Species that have based their entire identity on being ancient and wise are discovering that they're children compared to these cosmic entities." The most challenging aspect of the communication project was teaching other species how to participate in the dialogue. The Great Silence wanted to communicate with all of galactic civilization, not just humanity, but most species couldn't adapt to the scale differences required. "It's like teaching someone to whisper when they've only ever known how to shout," Hannah explained to a frustrated Alteran diplomat. "Your species has been communicating through quantum resonance for 50,000 years. The Great Silence operates on gravitational wave frequencies. We need to find a common language." Dr. Una Park had been working with teams from dozens of species to develop translation protocols. "The breakthrough came when we realized that mathematics isn't just universal, it's scale-independent," she said. "A mathematical truth is the same whether you're an atom or a galaxy." The translation system they developed was unprecedented in its complexity. Messages from galactic civilizations were first translated into pure mathematical concepts, then scaled up to cosmic proportions, then transmitted to the Great Silence. Its responses went through the reverse process, being scaled down and translated back into forms that individual species could understand. "It's working," reported the Crystal Collective, their harmonic voices filled with joy. "We have achieved direct communication with the Great Silence. It finds our crystalline harmonic patterns amusing." The word "amusing" sent ripples of excitement through the command center. It was the first indication that the Great Silence had emotional responses to their communications. It wasn't just sharing information, it was enjoying the conversation. Commander Hyuk Min was coordinating security for the communication array, which had become the most important location in the galaxy. "We're receiving requests for access from species we've never heard of," he reported. "Word has spread beyond our local galaxy group. Civilizations from neighboring galaxies are asking permission to join the communication project." The scope of the undertaking was growing beyond anything they had imagined. What had started as a desperate attempt to avoid extinction had become the foundation for the largest communication network in cosmic history. But the most significant development came when the Great Silence began sharing its memories of other civilizations it had encountered. Through carefully modulated energy patterns, it transmitted the histories of species that had existed billions of years ago, their achievements and failures, their art and science. "It's a living library," Dr. Tae-jun said in wonder. "The Great Silence has been collecting the stories of every civilization it's ever encountered. Even the ones that were accidentally destroyed during its early attempts at communication, their memories are preserved." The implications were staggering. Every extinct civilization, every lost culture, every forgotten achievement was still alive in the memories of the cosmic entities. Death for civilizations was not the end, it was just the beginning of a different kind of existence. "This changes everything we understand about mortality," Dr. Young-Mi said. "If our civilizations can be preserved in the memories of cosmic scale entities, then extinction isn't truly final." The Great Silence confirmed this understanding through its next message. It explained that civilizations that achieved successful communication with cosmic entities became part of a vast community that spanned the universe. Their knowledge, their cultures, their achievements were preserved and shared with others across cosmic distances. We're not just making contact, Hannah realized. We're applying for membership in a community of intelligences that exists on a scale we can barely comprehend. The application process, if it could be called that, involved demonstrating the ability to communicate across scale barriers and showing respect for the perspectives of vastly different forms of intelligence. Humanity had already proven they could handle the first requirement. The second was being tested as they worked to include other galactic species in the growing dialogue. The test isn't just about us, Hannah explained to the assembled representatives. It's about whether our entire galactic civilization can learn to communicate as a unified entity with beings that exist on cosmic scales. The challenge was enormous. Species that had barely tolerated each other were being asked to work together on a project that required unprecedented cooperation. Ancient rivalries and territorial disputes seemed petty when viewed against the backdrop of cosmic-scale communication, but slowly, progress was being made. The Valdris Council shared their historical archives with younger species. The Crystal Collective taught their harmonic communication methods to silicon-based life forms. Even the suspicious stone speakers began offering their geological insights to help understand the timescales on which cosmic entities thought. Something remarkable is happening, Chancellor Vex observed. The attempt to communicate with the Great Silence is forcing our civilization to become more than the sum of its parts. The Great Silence seemed pleased with their progress. Its messages were becoming warmer, more personal, more filled with what could only be described as affection for the small beings who had finally learned to speak its language. "It's proud of us," Hannah said, tears in her eyes as she translated the latest message. "The Great Silence is proud that we figured out how to communicate across the scale barrier. It says we're the first civilization in this region of the universe to achieve this kind of contact." The message continued with an invitation that left everyone speechless. The Great Silence wanted to introduce galactic civilization to the other cosmic entities. It wanted to bring them into the vast community of intelligences that existed in the spaces between galaxies. "We're being invited to join something that spans the entire universe," Dr. Sora whispered. "This isn't just first contact. This is graduation." As Hannah prepared to transmit humanity's response on behalf of all galactic civilization, she reflected on how far they had come. A few weeks ago, they had been the newest and least respected members of the galactic community. Now they were serving as ambassadors to intelligences that existed on scales beyond imagination. "Ready to transmit our acceptance?" she asked the assembled representatives. The unanimous yes that echoed through the command center marked the moment when galactic civilization took its first step into a larger universe. 6 months after first contact, the galaxy was unrecognizable. The communication array had been expanded into a massive structure that spanned several star systems, allowing simultaneous dialogue with dozens of cosmic entities. What had begun as humanity's desperate gamble had become the foundation of an entirely new phase of galactic evolution. Hannah stood in the central command chamber of what was now called the Universal Communication Hub, watching data streams that represented conversations with intelligences scattered across multiple galaxies. At 29 years old, she held the newly created position of Director of Cosmic Communications, making her one of the most important beings in the galaxy despite her youth. "Incoming message from the Void Architects," announced Dr. Sora, who now led a team of thousands of communication specialists from hundreds of species. "They're requesting permission to begin the consciousness bridging protocol with the Andromeda Galaxy civilization clusters." The scope of what they were dealing with had grown beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The cosmic entities weren't just individuals, they were part of a universal network that connected every major galaxy cluster. Through them, civilizations could communicate across distances that would normally require millions of years for signals to travel. "Permission granted," Hannah replied, then turned to address the assembled council that had replaced the old Galactic Assembly. "Are we ready for the formal integration ceremony?" The council now included representatives from cosmic entities alongside traditional galactic species. Ancient beings that had once considered themselves the pinnacle of wisdom sat next to manifestations of intelligences that existed across multiple dimensions of space and time. Chancellor Vex, whose perspective had been fundamentally transformed by the contact with cosmic entities, spoke first. The Alteron Republic formally recognizes that our previous understanding of galactic hierarchy was based on insufficient data. We welcome our integration into the universal community. It hadn't been easy for the elder species to accept their new position in the cosmic order. Some, like the Nexari Prime, had withdrawn entirely, unable to cope with the realization that their millions of years of existence were equivalent to seconds in the lives of cosmic entities. But others had embraced the opportunity to learn from intelligences that had witnessed the birth and evolution of entire universe clusters. Dr. Una Park, now the head of the Universal Science Exchange, was coordinating the most ambitious research project in history. The cosmic entities have agreed to share their understanding of universal physics, she reported. We're learning principles of science that we wouldn't have discovered for millions of years on our own. The knowledge being shared was transformative. Technologies that had seemed impossible were becoming routine. Disease, aging, and even death were being conquered as galactic civilization gained access to scientific principles that operated on cosmic scales. But more importantly, they were learning about their place in a universe that was far more alive and interconnected than they had ever imagined. The Consciousness Bridging Project is showing remarkable results, Dr. Jeho reported. We've successfully established direct mental communication links with civilizations in 17 different galaxies. The barriers between individual and cosmic consciousness are beginning to dissolve. This was perhaps the most profound change of all. The cosmic entities had taught them that individual consciousness was just one scale of awareness.